Roll call?
Chair. Sherry Bilderbeck. Yeah, thank you. Martha Vaza.
Here.
Matt Foreman.
Here.
Jeff Hunt.
Here.
Carl Carlin.
Here.
Jeff Moore, we know, is not here. Paul Moran here. Hart Nelson is also excused. Brian Nolan, not yet, maybe. John Nurnberger. Here. John Ritter, no. Lisa Shearing.
Here.
We have a quorum, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Do we have an approval for the agenda by proclamation? All in favor? Okay. Any changes to last month's meeting minutes? No? Okay, by proclamation, all in favor? All right. Okay. Any citizens wish to comment on anything that is not on tonight's agenda? See anyone? Nobody online? Okay. Moving on to old business. Item number 23-006, text amendment for stormwater management. We have anyone presenting? Or?
So this is a carryover from the previous meeting. The staff report kind of outlined all of the red lines for you. Based on the discussion at the prior meeting, the open questions are generally, do we want to increase the allowed square footage or the minimum square footage of new coverage from 200, anywhere between 200 to 500, or just go with 500? There is, a cost difference. The code currently has anything under 500 square feet is $500 permit fee. Anything over that is $1,000. So that would be further additions if we moved it up to 500, but anything between 200 and 500 is the question before the board tonight. And if there were any other changes that you wished for us to consider as part of the recommendation from Gonzalez. Right. We can,
Yeah,
if you have
correct.
some questions, we can go through some. Yeah. Well, yeah, I would need a motion. Yeah.
Need a motion, right? Okay, that was, okay. Okay, so that was the only change.
Recommend approval of text amendments for the stormwater infill development as presented during the August 9th, as referred to during the August 9th Planning and Zoning Commission meeting.
And a second?
Sherry Bilderbeck. Okay, we can't actually hear you. I can see you took your microphone off mute. I think it must be at our end, right? No. Abstain. Okay, thank you. Matt Foreman.
Yes. Excuse me.
Jeff Hunt.
Yes.
Carl Carlin.
Yes.
Paul Moran, yes. John Nurnberger.
Yes.
Sharing.
Yes.
So that is passed, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, nice. Nice.
Sorry, I believe your microphone is off.
I'm sorry, thank you. That passed. Next business, or next item for old business is item number 23-011 for text amendment for article for off-street parking and loading regulations. Do we have a presentation, or did we discuss this last month? This is a holdover, so.
This is a whole new presentation, but
Okay.
for the record, can we Brian Nolan has joined us at 6:36.
That'll be in your permanent record.
Round button on the side.
Here?
Yes. There we go.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the Planning and Zoning Commission. My name is Lee Cannon. I'm a principal with CBB here in St. Louis. And we were asked by the planning staff to take a look at the Brentwood parking code to see if we would recommend any revisions to various land uses in the code, and to look at the code itself to identify potential improvements that we might suggest. Last month, we presented information on the restaurant land use and kind of gave you an overview of what we had done to evaluate the existing parking code and compare it to other nearby and similar communities. So I won't rehash the how we did that, but I will go through the highlights of the changes that were made. So as part of our project, we looked at, I'm on the wrong button. We looked at multifamily dwellings and apartments, motels and hotels, indoor retail businesses, grocery store, supermarket, banking facilities, and pet care facilities. To remind you, we looked at the codes for St. Charles County, St. Louis County, various other municipalities nearby, and came up with was an evaluation where various communities and agencies look at parking in different ways. So for instance, with the restaurant use, there's square footage, there's seats, there are employees. Some people remove space that doesn't accommodate patrons, like they leave the kitchen out or the stairwells or elevator shafts, those types of things. And complex codes can be more difficult to implement for staff that may have to identify these pieces of developments. And for spec developers that might be doing a mixed use, they may have a square on the page that's 3,000 square feet. They don't know who the tenant is, much less how many seats or employees that tenant's going to have in the restaurant. So as part of our overview, we recommended that the city go to a gross floor area, which is, building walls, what is the size of the facility. And again, the code is just a guide to determine what the individual land use may generate. And if a tenant comes to Brentwood and says, well, I need more parking than that, then, or I need less parking than that, then they could, under the code, provide you with a parking study to detail their knowledge of their business, and it would be up to you to determine whether or not you could approve that revision specifically to that proposed development. So currently, for multifamily dwelling units, Brentwood requires 2 per unit. And then there is an age elderly apartment identified 60 plus, where it's a half space per unit. Motels, hotels is 1 per guest room plus 1/2 per employee. Indoor retail business is 5 per 1,000, grocery stores 6 per 1,000, banking is at 4.5 per 1,000, and pet care is at 2.5 per 1,000. So through the processes, we looked at the different comparable communities, and we had to come up with a way to normalize all of the different different codes. So we came up with parking scenarios. So for instance, we looked at 3800 Laclede, which is has all the characteristics available for a multifamily development, and we were able, across the different codes, to normalize those calculations. So for an example, under multifamily housing, Brentwood's code at 2 per thousand for 314 units would require 628 parking stalls. Other codes would have less, some codes would have more. We figured the mean and the median, so the average versus the middle value comparatively of these data points. And we also took into account something that the commission mentioned last time, which was, what we really would like to do is to reduce the auto dependency and the impacts of overparking where available in Brentwood. So based on that, we came up with a recommendation for this specific land use to go from 2 per unit to 1.5 per unit, which is where St. Louis County is currently. And so that would be 471 parking stalls. So I don't know that you would like for me to go through each and every one of these, but for the elderly housing, Brentwood was already at a relatively low level at 1/2 per unit. As you can see in the graphics, for hotel motel, Brentwood was right around the median already at that rate. And based on each one of these analyses, we have recommended for most of the land uses that there be a reduction in the minimum required parking per code. On page 13 of our report, kind of summarize that. For multifamily dwellings, going to 1.5 stalls per unit. For the elderly population, the 60+ multifamily, we're actually talking about making an increase from 1/2 stall to 0.85 stalls per unit. I think that's a little low. Now those aren't assisted living and those types of facilities. These are just apartments that have a restriction about who can live there. It generally means that there's not kids, young people in the homes. And folks that are over 60 generally travel less and may be more apt to have limited incomes, less reliance on single occupant vehicles. Motels, hotels going to 0.9 stalls per sleeping room, or in the hotel industry, sometimes they call those keys. Indoor retail business going down to 4 stalls per thousand. And keeping grocery stores and supermarkets a little higher than just your average indoor retail business at 4.5 stalls per thousand. And banking facilities going down to 3.5 stalls per thousand. And again, this keeps Brentwood near their peers in the mean and median, but on the lower end of the mean and median versus the higher end, which is where we were looking before with restaurants. One land use, pet care facilities. There wasn't a specific definition in the code of what that is. Is that a vet, or is it a place like a Petco or PetSmart that sells all kinds of pet items retail, or is that a grooming? So there's a lot of different things that could be considered pet care facilities. So one would have to determine the differential between a pet care facility or an indoor retail business to use that. Based on limited amount of information in that kind of vague definition of pet care, we recommended that 2.5 stalls per thousand that you have today remain in place. Does anybody, the other thing that we'll cover also in the review of the code, we were asked whether or not the city should adopt a parking maximum. And I think, again, because the code is going to allow, or currently does allow, shared parking studies or parking studies to evaluate tenant-specific parking needs, it does make sense to provide that guidance to developers that you would like to have a maximum. We set that maximum based on other codes that we've seen, which basically just say that the maximum is 120% of the minimum code. So that's also recommended herein. And if you look at the 120%, that's about what we've shaved off several of the old codes. So the code requirements for these land uses that we looked at from Brentwood. So if you add 20% to the recommended rates, they're pretty much back up at the previous minimum rate. Does anybody have any questions about those rates before I move along?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. Yep, Mr. Cannon, there were some notes from the last meeting that about medical doctors' offices, and I don't know if we covered doctors' offices and dental offices requirements.
Right. We didn't. Oh, go ahead.
I can address that. That was not specifically asked of the applicant or CBB at this time, but based upon discussion with some of the members on a prior item that came before you before I got here, I thought maybe we would want to revisit that if that's something we want to consider. So if you look in the staff report on page 7, it was not part of the initial request. Medical office and dental office and clinics are currently at 5 spaces per 1,000. General office is at 3.5. So the question is, Lee has indicated that they do find that medical uses are generally a half space to a full space more than a general office is needed. So do we want to include that as part of a text amendment to lower it to maybe 4.5 or 4? And then the 20% bonus would allow for above that. And I did do a comparison with the Retina Institute. They initially, I'm gonna read it again. They required was 64 spaces and they had 82, they wanted 82 spaces provided. So if we did the 20% at the maximum of 120%, they would still require a parking study, because that would, under the current rate of 5 per 1,000. If we were to lower it to the 3.5 for the building, that would be required for 45 spaces with a maximum of the 120% at 54 spaces. If we increased it to 4.5, that would be 69 spaces at the maximum of 120%. So if that is something we want to continue, that came in after the fact, and I didn't know if that was something that really needed to be reviewed by CBB, but I wanted I thought we should discuss it since it's come up before.
And as Whitney mentioned, that land use, those 2 land uses weren't specifically in our scope, so they're not in our documentation. But we did do some investigation, had quite a lengthy discussion about that, differences between office and medical office. And if you will, for those of you that work in offices or used to on a regular basis before the COVID-19 situation, medical dental offices generally about the same sizes for things like exam rooms and such with reception areas. But then if you go to a dental hygienist or see the doctor, you got 2 people in that space. And that's generally kind of the reason that we see about a half space to a full space more per 1,000 square feet than you would see in a general office setting. But you could have also a call center that might be considered office space based on the Brentwood code, and they could have a lot more per unit, but that call center would also know that it's a call center, and when they came to apply, they would need to let you know how many people they intend to employ per square foot and rationalize why they should have a larger parking area.
And as I recall, Mr. Chairman, the Retina Institute wanted additional parking because they had employees coming there and being shuttled to other locations. So I think they had a special request. They're not just using parking just for things that are going on. I remember that clearly because there was a number of questions and a lot of interest from the community on why they have such a big parking lot. But I do remember that. I think they're using it for
Not aware of that. Thank you.
for point of clarification.
So I'm not totally familiar with the process, right? Are we proactive in telling a business that might be coming into Brentwood, are we proactive that these are only guidelines and we'll work with you? Or do new businesses feel handcuffed, or do they know enough about the process that all of this can be a negotiation? Because all the different examples that we've just given, the park and ride, right, you know, the call center and the dental office, there's going to be no rule that can possibly work for each of those, right?
Correct.
It's going to have to be on a case-by-case basis. So I think the more we leave it that way, the better. So I don't see any need to change anything that isn't already in scope. I would
Okay.
just leave things alone personally, because it's always going to be discussed anyway by the group.
And your code currently provides for the ability of any applicant to petition to have less spaces. We're adding this notion to bring the Brentwood Code to a more current type of a standard with a maximum, again, indicating a preference. The more details that the city can provide in the code, it helps developers understand expectations, so then they don't have unknowns. And when they know they want more parking than you require, they know on the front end that they're going to have to do a study and pay for that, improve it, and come up with data to support it. And so your current code already allows that to go less than the minimum. And every business is different. I gave an example last time about how, you know, a Burger King and a Chick-fil-A may be the same size. And you probably don't want to require them to both have the same parking stalls.
General intent to look at the entire parking is so that we did not have to have every applicant go through a parking study. Currently, we see a lot of that. We have some non-conforming uses. So the attempt was tried to get it into a more standardized proposal, and only when it's needed to show more or less than what is required would Lee need to be brought in, and the applicants would have to pay for that. So,
Questions, comments? Yeah.
We discussed the restaurant standards last time, and I see that they're actually in the item we'll vote on, although we haven't discussed it tonight. So I just wanted to make sure if someone wasn't here that they knew that. So, but you know, I'm in favor of those changes as discussed last time. So.
And Whitney, does the current staff report reflect the 12, 14, 14?
no, the last I got from you was 16, 14.
16, 14, okay.
It is restaurants and other eating and drinking establishments without a drive-through or carryout is 16 per 1,000 square feet.
Okay.
And we're excluding any outdoor areas. And carryout, drive-in, or fast food restaurants is 14 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area, excluding any outdoor dining. And then we've added bar, lounge, nightclub at 16 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of gross floor area.
Okay.
So,
That's correct.
okay.
Thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question? And I was not here last month, so I probably missed out on a lot of great discussion, it sounds like. But when we say the patio area is excluded, I can think of one business where they have an outdoor area and there are tables and it is usually full unless the weather is horrible. So how do we navigate that?
So, yeah, Lee.
That's one of the issues that we address, because in general terms, restaurateurs will tell you that when their patio's open, their kitchen has a certain capacity and they have a certain amount of staff, and they're not servicing all the tables in the restaurant. Now, some locations may be successful to where they decide to do both. So in those instances, they would need more parking for their business than they would require under your code. As I do traffic and parking studies for the city and private developers in different locations and other cities as well, I generally find that businesses where we say that they need to do a traffic study and that there's a additional turn lane needed on the road, they're not all that excited about that because it costs a lot of money and they see that as a limited benefit and their responsibility to fix the road as limited that also serves other people. Now, on the flip side of that, for a business to be successful, they need to provide enough parking so that they don't upset their patrons, right? So most businesses that are operated with, in good faith and with the knowledge of how to run a successful business want to provide plenty of parking, not too much, but enough for their patrons to continue to come back. And another thing that we see with parking, as another aside, in some places, in large developments with large parking lots, there's plenty of parking in the lot. It's just not enough parking where the people want to use it. So there's a few examples of that in Brentwood as well, where if you can put the high parking attractors far enough away from each other, you wouldn't see parking problems. But when they're, say, for instance, directly opposite one another in a large center, their overlap tends to create problems. So those are things that the city can think about when they see developments and how they're laid out, especially for large parking lots. So, go ahead.
Just to add to the discussion on the restaurant outdoor area, if you look on page 2 of the staff report here,
Do I have to touch anything?
like we have included under the discussion of gross floor area, section 1500 floor area, that the floor area and total floor area shall not include patio space for restaurants as long as the total number of service seats, tables is not increased when the patio is open as compared to the number when the patio is closed. So, I mean, this may be a little difficult to enforce, but we would only be able to enforce it should there become an issue where a restaurant is overpacked and they've overpacked the outdoor dining area. Then we would have to get into an enforcement. But the idea is, as Lee discussed in the last meeting, that most restaurants don't generally have the capacity to do both at the same time. And because the patio is generally open for the summer or nice weather, that we did not want to have the same parking ratio for it full-time when it's only being used partially of the year, so.
And as part of that, with the outdoor dining spaces needing less parking, one might say, well, how is the city going to enforce that? Well, unless people going to one business are parking in a neighborhood or in somebody else's parking stalls, it's not negatively impacting anyone else. So the idea of when do we know we need to deal with that would be when neighbors and adjacent properties are having problems, and it's generally pretty easy to tell who's creating the problem when it's occurring. And then the city could use its code to say, okay, well, now we want to check out what's going on. And
The reason I bring this up is I think we do have an existing business that does have parking challenges, and they do have attract a lot of people at certain points in time. I just would want us to be thoughtful about how we're going to handle this with the development over on Manchester starts to kick off and we start to get a lot of requests. I would hope we would be positioned so that we don't get ourselves in a situation where we have other businesses in that area or residential overflow, because I think that's what we're dealing with often at this one location.
And these issues generally present themselves more starkly for standalone businesses. When you have a larger mixed-use development, the mixed uses by design, it may have different needs at different times. So when the office component of the development is high, the movie theater is low, and then vice versa in the evening. And those types of mixed uses make for good partners. So the larger developments generally have less parking impacts than the individual business that only has so much ground, and all that ground is either the building, the parking, or the landscaping.
Any other comments or questions?
So I was going to go over the
go ahead.
code, the general code items that are in the other document, the recommendations for alterations to Article 4 parking. And these are written more eloquently in the staff report, but I wanted to kind of highlight in the provisions that I sent over to the planning department. First one is the fact that we are recommending this notion of a maximum parking, and we had recommended 120%. That number could be another number, depending on how comfortable you are with that recommendation. Like 130% or 125, but 120 generally is taking into account the differential from what you had to what we're recommending. We're shaving off about 20% of the requirements across the board in the land uses we looked at. There was one clarification that we put in the general applicability, which was the idea that when a business comes in to expand, that their existing parking requirement would be grandfathered in at some level, and that they would only be required to accommodate the additional parking based on the addition. The additional net square footage would have to meet the current code, and the old part of the building would be whatever it had been approved at.
That one seems a little vague if, as part of an expansion, they're renovating an existing facility, office, restaurant, and increasing density within the existing.
Yeah, so the question would be, some communities talk about up to a certain amount of additional square footage or up to an additional percentage of existing square footage. So if you add more than 25% of the existing, then you have to meet the full code for the new building. If you do less than that, then you only have to meet the new code for the additional space. So you could consider how you wanted to address that. We recommended adding a section, and I think we have something down below that says that you can't count off-site parking towards the parking requirements for your building unless there is a written document easement that's been submitted to the city. So that is, hey, the person next door is willing to let me park over there. You say, well, that's great, but if you're going to count it towards your requirement, you have to share it with us. If you're not counting it towards your requirement, that's just a private deal between the two of you.
That is a general requirement in the code as well, elsewhere, yeah.
We recommended going away from the two different definitions, gross leasable area, or what the Brentwood Code calls floor area, which removes certain pieces of the building. That's a calculation that unless you have a floor plan for the building, and even if you do, you probably have to get an architect to calculate that for you. Squares can be calculated very easily, and if it's a different shape, you can always, you can generally calculate total floor area, gross floor area pretty quickly. So we're recommending that these codes now apply to gross floor area only when we're talking about the code requirement. Whitney already mentioned the issue about the patio not counting as long as the seats and tables did not increase. And if you had somebody that came in and said, well, no, we plan to use them both at the same time, then the answer is, okay, well, then you need to meet the code for both. Easy enough. Talked about adding a section to accommodate outdoor sales space. You encounter this like at Home Depot, where they have allocated a lot of their parking stalls to stuff, and do they count those in their code requirement or not? They have sheds during the spring and summer. They have trees and shrubs and plants. And so if those aren't in parking stalls, then the code doesn't really apply. But if they're taking up parking stalls that are being counted towards their requirement, then they would need to be addressed specifically. Gas stations and convenience stores do that too, with windshield wiper fluid and things like that, firewood in the certain times of the year. We're recommending adding a condition specifically about shared parking. The current code talks about, down below, about just being able to immediately discount 50% of the required parking where there's shared uses. And I would tend to suggest that there's so many different types of mixes that you wouldn't want to just set an arbitrary number, that you would actually want to ask for a shared parking analysis for the mixture of uses in the proposed development. Another thing to consider, and again, this is just a clarification in the shared parking, that the total number of spaces in a mixed-use development, could be less, or shouldn't be less than the sum of the total requirements, unless it's an approved shared parking study.
Approved by who?
By the
Planning,
city,
yeah.
yes.
So the shared parking would be part of a review of a site development plan or a conditional use permit. And so that would be reviewed with the parking study at that time and reviewed at the Planning and Zoning Commission and Board of Aldermen for approval.
So some of the clarifications that we've had in these sections are all about the shared parking study. We also indicated clarification that the parking study needs to be done by a PTOE, which is a specific kind of engineer that deals with traffic and parking issues and doesn't build bridges and design, water treatment facilities. So I believe that was the last item that we included in the report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about our recommended revisions for the general provisions of the parking code.
So I did read through it quickly before, but so all of those are included in the motion we vote on tonight?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can we pull up the staff report and look at 1590?
So the questions within the staff report include, do we want to have the statement that the total number of seating, including the patio, needs to remain the same, or exclude the patio altogether given the limited time frame in which the patio is used? That was the main question. I've included the 120% maximum. Like under the, where the minimum and maximum number of parking spaces are required. The 1590 is what you were asking, exemption from required parking. Under C is where it states that the Board of Aldermen, upon affirmative recommendation from the Planning and Zoning Commission, may authorize a reduction or an increase above the 120% maximum in the number of parking and loading spaces required by this chapter after a study done by a registered professional engineer certified nationally as a professional traffic operations engineer. So,
I guess I was a little confused. It seems like the changes to 1550 and 1570 are incorporated in the authority of the zoning board and ultimately the Board of Aldermen to approve deviations from that upon receipt of a parking study. So is that to make them consistent, or?
yeah, it was to pretty much to make them consistent and to clarify that it really needs to be done by a professional traffic operations engineer, yeah, versus, currently it just says any engineer, so I'm like, oh, well, can we have our stormwater engineer do a traffic study, you know? Like, it really needs to be a traffic engineer so, that does that, so.
The general theme of a parking code is that it's generic. It can't address every situation, but you have to have something to provide as a guide for people to understand what your intent is. And if they understand what they need in a more detailed version of what the code says, then they're welcome to provide a study that gets reviewed by the board, and you all can decide whether you trust the judgment provided in that report. Now, the city currently has CBB on call, and the current process that they encourage is that the developer use CBB as the city's engineer, so they pay the city. We create a memorandum of understanding with a scope and a fee to address the minimum level of traffic and or parking issues that we feel that they need to address to maintain safe and efficient operations of the roads and an adequate amount of parking. So if they do that process, then CBB will follow our typical industry standard procedures and come up with what we recommend to you as a comfortable number of spaces for that site. However, I don't believe that the city mandates that they use us. So they wanted to provide enough instruction that if the developer wants to use their own parking expert, that they have the information available in the code as to what's expected for them to do their own study.
So help me understand the triggers for some of those evaluation processes. So if you're hitting all the benchmarks and staff is looking at something, does staff still have the latitude to say, I know you're checking all the boxes, but I think there's a problem over here. Is there a route within the documented code for us to require those other steps or to open the door for further studies? You were talking about square footage calculations, and unfortunately I've done a lot of those, so I know there's a lot of games to play with, you know, BOMA calculations and net versus gross and usable, rentable, parts of sidewalks, all of the legalese and the rent stuff could actually have a direct impact on the parking spaces. But none of that's qualified here, and if you're looking at a single floor, the first floor of a multi-tenant office building that's a differing use, then where are the triggers for that restaurant use within an office building? And looking at the square footage and the time of day, and it's got a common area assigned to it because it's part of the first floor of the building, and the square footage numbers get fuzzy. Where's our big red lever to say we're gonna require a study?
So to address the last part of that question, for instance, when we did a parking study for the Drury development on Eager Road that has a Bonefish Grill in the first floor.
And meeting rooms and convention rooms.
Yes, so meeting rooms generally are part of the definition of a hotel. Conference space is not. So where's the trigger between what is part of the hotel in normal operation versus a conference space, which may be bigger and bring in offsite guests? Restaurants are typically part of hotels, but some restaurants draw outside patrons and others don't. You don't see, and just a hypothetical, the Marriott down the street, and we don't leave the office and go to a Windjammer restaurant. That's part of the hotel. But people go to Bonefish that aren't staying at the hotel. Drury also does a product with Applebee's, and there's all kinds of other hotels that have a chain or an attractive restaurant that brings people in from the outside. So you have to define the land uses as appropriate. So with Bonefish, Drury, there's this many hotel keys and there's this much square footage of restaurant. And that's how I would have interpreted it from the current and the proposed code.
I would say, like, under recent reviews, such as at the Deerberg Shopping Center, I kind of do an initial review, and if there's enough parking, and I run it by Lee, and we both go, we don't think there's a need for a parking study, then they don't get charged. If I'm going, yeah, we have a concern, and we're gonna have to have you pay for the parking study, staff is allowed to do that, to show.
And that's fundamentally the question. If
Yes.
our ordinances are built in such a way that staff has the discretion to require it,
Yes,
then that goes back to your description of generic starting point, base expectations to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis.
right.
So generally speaking, if a development comes in and they say, hey, we want to build X with Y spaces, and you check the code and they're above the minimum and below the maximum, then you wouldn't require them to do a parking study. Was your question, is there a mechanism in the code that even though they fit in between the minimum and maximum, does the city have the authority to require a special traffic study? Was that your question?
That is a component of that question, because it's one of those, does it pass a rough evaluation, a first blush look to say, hey, we think something's off, we need a deeper.
Yeah, that would be it. When I get the application, that's a part of my initial review, and then I would call Lee to have them provide a memorandum of understanding for the applicant to reimburse the city for that cost for his review, if it's needed. Like a recent application came in that will probably be discussed at the next meeting, where they meet the parking code, but they're adjusting the layout. So that prompted the review from Lee. So just on that.
That's
yeah.
a good example. That kind
Yeah.
of, it looks right on paper, but there's something else that staff
Has a concern with, and
has
therefore.
critical thinking skills and says, this needs an extra look.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, going back to the 120% maximum. So you have hypothetically, like a neighborhood restaurant or a sit-down place or whatever, 4,000 or 5,000 square feet. You make them park at what, 16?
If 14, if they don't have a significant carry-out or drive-through business.
Okay, and that use blows out in a couple years, and the replacement is an urgent care or something that's at 5, 4.5, something like that, and they're just grossly overparked.
So they would not, again, so that's important. Reusing the building is a good thing, from a longevity business development, but if they don't fit, they don't fit. So a change of use would require an action, I believe.
Well,
if they don't fit in the
depends on
zoning.
review. Generally speaking, if it's a use by right and that it's permitted, then they can go in, and as long as they're with just a business license, it doesn't take additional review at the Planning and Zoning Commission or Board of Aldermen. I generally don't get into a traffic review at that point. It's only when the use is a conditional use permit do we start looking at the parking available and the traffic it might generate throughout for the entire site. So it could be that, yeah, say a restaurant goes in and they convert it to a urgent care facility down the road. Well, the site is pre-existing non-conforming. It's all built out. We don't want to have them rip out parking if, when it's by right, that kind of
Oh.
thing. So,
Were you just referencing if the site had too much parking and didn't need it?
Yeah, I
Okay,
mean,
okay,
I just want to,
okay.
we're going to require people to either get a parking study to try to prove that they do need that, even though they know they don't, or rip out parking.
Right.
That's, yeah, okay.
yeah, if it's a pre-existing building, then no, we wouldn't have them rip out parking for the use, so.
Just as a aside, if it's the other way around, if a mental facility wanted to go to a restaurant, they would have to do a conditional use permit to be able to go through the site plan and that sort of thing. So we would have some latitude to make sure that doesn't happen. They have to increase the parking and that sort of thing, so.
Okay, anybody else? Comments? All right, do we have a motion?
Do we want to take each of the questions at the bottom of the staff report separately, or just incorporate them all? Or was there not any concern with the patio, having it count for?
I would prefer to break them out. I don't like the patio changes.
Okay, well, let's break them out then. Let's do we have a motion excluding, I don't know how to word that. Yeah,
Believe the member's point is that we should continue to require parking for additional patio capacity. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, and that's what the current code requires, correct?
It only, correct. The assumption,
All right.
it only specifically states it in the sit-down restaurants. It doesn't specifically state it in the drive-through portion or carry-out. However, the other attorney has indicated that the assumption is it should be applied to both. So we either need to apply it to both, or do you want it to leave it as is, where it's only for the dining, dining. And do we want to look at having a less of a ratio for the outdoor space versus the indoors? Because the indoors would be used all year round versus the outdoor space.
I believe that, again, the member's motion, as I understood it, is to make no change in the current regulation with respect to patio dining parking requirements, correct?
Correct. Leave it
All right.
as is.
Then
Okay.
why don't we make that motion, vote on that, that answers that question.
Or do we have to vote on a motion and we're not going to be changing anything? But how would this affect the business that was in here last month, where we gave them permission to add patio space and not increase the parking?
If they're through.
Okay. I like that answer,
So, but
because it
As
would be
a-
really bad to pull the rug from underneath their feet.
I'm sorry?
It would be really bad for us to pull the rug from under their feet
That's
right
correct.
after they waved us goodbye.
But if that happens in the future, would that be a trigger for a parking study where someone would say, I'm not using the inside, I'm only using the outside, and I put it in writing, and I gave it to the city?
Again, yes, indeed, it can be. The parking study can be triggered because the staff believes that the information provided suggests the likelihood of a problem. Or the applicant says, I shouldn't have to follow your standards because. Either way, There's a study to assess that. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
A question about the proposed change, though, doesn't that give the staff more flexibility as to whether to count the patio space or not?
The proposed change currently, as worded, would eliminate needing to count the patio space altogether. Based upon the discussion in that most restaurant users don't have the capacity to fully staff both the indoor and out. They generally block off the areas because of the patio space on nice days.
But you could use that to count the patio area if,
The current proposal would eliminate counting it altogether.
So, okay.
Try.
Go ahead and try, yeah.
I move to recommend approval of text amendment related to Article 5, off-street parking, with the exception of the changes to 400.1500 related to not counting patio space for restaurants.
Okay, I think that basically the new motion with exception to keep the patio as is. Correct.
Without the, approving without that section changed.
A second.
Second.
Vote.
Sherry Bilderbeck.
Okay.
Vote is
Okay.
Woman.
Yes.
Jeff Hunt.
Yes.
Scott Carlin.
Yes.
Paul Moran, yes. Brian Nolan.
yes.
John Nurnberger. Yes. Sharing.
Yes.
Passed unanimously.
Okay, thank you. Motion passes. Next item of old business, the
Well, I
art.
think we need, that was just the patio.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well,
Oh, don't we have to pass the main?
do we need another motion?
The
to-
motion addressed the entire
Yeah.
report,
Oh, it did? Okay.
adjusting for the patio.
Yeah,
Okay, all right, thank you.
so all the
Okay.
changes with exception to the patio.
Okay, thank you.
Got it. Okay. So next item of old business, RFQ architectural design guidelines. Do we have a presentation?
Really, this is just staff presenting.
Okay.
So the city did issue an RFQ, I'm sorry, in May, and with the deadline 1st of mid-June, we've received 5 applications. Myself and Matt Foreman and Carl Carlin reviewed those 5 applications, and our top pick is H3 Studio. John Hall is here tonight. The initial proposal came in a little high, so he did revise his proposal at approximately $84,000 for the architectural design guidelines. They had excellent examples of Clayton and Glenwood. Clayton, I think, is a little more detailed than we wanted to get, so that's why I worked with him to get the price down. We are focusing, it would include focusing on the commercial areas for the town center area of South Brentwood Boulevard and the rest of the Manchester corridor, and then be more general in recommendations for elsewhere. Look at the residential components would also be more general, but there might be some discussion for, I know there's one neighborhood that has covenants or restrictions to only want single-family or single-story homes with some minor changes. So we could look at how those are incorporated into the design guidelines. And then they could also look at additional funding would be if we need them to look at zoning code recommendation changes and how we could address the design if needed as part of the zoning code. Because a lot of their prior examples have indicated that a lot of the design guidelines had a lot to do with the zoning code. So making sure those mesh well together is what they would look at.
Discussion?
So, to understand, are you still presenting? I'm sorry. Is
Oh,
there-
no, I was just, if you have any questions, this is John Hall of H3 Studio.
So what we're voting on would be the authorization to start the process of drafting those requirements. We're not voting on requirements at
No,
all.
this is just making your recommendation to the Board of Aldermen that you would like to enter into a contract for H3 Studio to start working on drafting the recommendations and working with staff and with the board and public process. They do say that it would take a year-long process. So this is just entering into the contract for them to start that.
And then this body would get to vote on the results of that project, and
Yeah.
as well as the Board of Aldermen, and study that. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, I guess, discussion on that? No questions? Okay, how about a motion?
I don't know the name.
Outline the.
Okay, yeah, why don't you go ahead and
Okay.
stand up, introduce
Good
yourself.
evening, everyone.
and, yes.
Nice to meet you all. So what I'll do is I'll just sort of outline the process, the kind of scope. It's a 4-phase scope.
Could you state your name and for the
John
record?
Hall, principal of H3 Studio.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a 4-phase planning process. Take about a year. It's got fairly extensive community engagement and staff engagement in. Phase 1, we basically review all your regulations. Again, the consistency from your comp plan to your zoning code to architectural standards must be seamless. And so we'll spend time looking at all of those. Your comp plan sets up some very distinctive character zones within your city. We would want to understand those. We also do field work at that time to see where you have all the inconsistencies to it. The other thing that we do during this phase is we look at your recent development, what you've given approval for, and register what architectural standards they were used at that time, because that's kind of an insight into if there's any inconsistencies in your review process and your approval process. And we collect all of that. Simultaneously, during that time, we will run through a series of meetings with the Architectural Review Board, yourselves, and the Sustainability Commission. And we're also recommending that together with staff, we put together a steering committee. Those would be really important stakeholders that ultimately would have to approve the plan, as well as perhaps some key representation from your community. So we'll take all of that, and through the first phase, we'll basically come out with a long list of all the challenges that you have relative to that, as well as all the successes you've had. We then use that to move into phase 2, and this is a really important phase, because what we're trying to do is for your commercial guidelines, as well as your residential guidelines, establish a set of agreed upon principles. So the buildings should look like this. They should sit on the site in this way, and the whole sets of relationships. This is quite often where we get into that complex area of which does it sit in the zoning code or does it sit in ARB, right? And we won't know that until we've really made that long list, whether you have those type of issues. But we want to try and establish a set of principles. Under the commercial area, we'll set up 3 different ways that you could think about those, and we'll take those all out again through yourselves, through the 3 groups again, as well as have some focus group meetings with commercial developers and the residential component. So phase 2 is really trying to establish the baseline of what you are trying to achieve. We then take all of that away, we write a draft of the guidelines, we run that through the whole process again, and then we produce the final in phase 4. So it'll be at least 4 interactions with you all through this. You'll see all of that work coming along, as well as trying to have a steering committee where key representation from all those approval bodies are really important. Because we know that architectural guidelines can get really tense. at certain points. And and remember, they're guidelines, whereas your codes are not a guideline, right? So what sits in codes versus guidelines is always a very complex issue, and will be the important part that you will have to decide how detailed or not detailed they go. And what regulatory authority. It gets quite complex as an example where you, for instance, move into consolidation of lots, because suddenly your buildings become a lot bigger. So how big a building versus the architectural guidelines become very interesting challenges as we go, as well as when you go more into subdivisions as well. So this is where that interaction and setting the stage for architectural guidelines, I'm sure will be very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions, comments? Okay, do we have them?
Oh.
Go. Oh, yeah, hi, Sherry. Is it the? Yeah, we're still in the previous. Yeah,
Sherry said, please read my comments to the PNC since no one can hear me for some reason. I'm 100% opposed to this and believe it's a very bad idea for a host of reasons, as I've said before. PNC has done an excellent job on commercial without design guidelines. It's the worst thing having these for commercial, but it's a bad idea for anywhere in Brentwood, in my opinion.
okay.
I respectfully disagree with that comment. As, excuse me, chair of the Architectural Review Board and a member serving for 17 years, our intent is never to dictate style. Actually, our parking engineer said it very nicely in his presentation about documenting requirements for quality so builders are aware of the requirements of the city. We are not about dictating style. We want to talk about quality and we want to talk about the environments that we're building. I would never support something that would say everything must be colonial. You know, that is not our intent. Our intent is to communicate the standards to builders, both commercial and residential, very similar to what we've already got in the commercial zoning for the Manchester Road guidelines. That theoretical approach should be expanded so that developers coming in are understanding our expectations before they come to us. It'll make for a much more efficient, satisfying process across the board.
I just had a question about what about the areas that have the first floor, they don't want a two-story house in their neighborhood and that sort of thing. How you handle that?
So that one was a specific case for an Architectural Review Board submission that was submitted and withdrawn before the board had to rule on that. The longstanding approach for the city, including the Architectural Review Board, is that the city does not enforce the covenants of the neighborhoods. That is not our purview.
Right.
So if there's a covenant within the neighborhood, and I would have to lean on council to tell us about the trigger requirements for active neighborhood association approval being required before the city can act. And I don't believe that is actually a current requirement.
It should not be. It is not, to the best of my knowledge. The city can enforce its ordinances. The city has no authority to approve, enforce, or waive private restrictions on property through subdivision indentures. Those are private contractual arrangements between the buyer of property and the developer or the owners of the trust that manages the common ground of the subdivision. They are not enforced by the city. They are not relevant to the city. And you know, that we have nothing to do with them. We have no authority to enforce any laws other than the ones we make.
So what about the fact, like, some areas have siding, some areas have brick or whatever, like requiring brick in certain areas. Would that could be an issue coming up as well?
That issue comes up almost
Yeah,
every
I know,
meeting.
I know that. I'm just saying, I'm saying, if we set these guidelines, architectural review, is that gonna be in that plan, or I don't know how detailed they get in those plans or whatever, is that gonna be in that plan, or?
So we're actually getting into the process that he's talking
Yeah.
about of how are we going to adjudicate this going forward? And our guiding principles that we do actually have posted on the website right now, just as guidelines, not code, are that we are evaluating the massing, how big is your property, the context, what is around your property that you want to work on. And I should qualify, I'm talking about the residential for architectural review.
Yeah.
And then the third would be the materiality. So those three components together, we balance to try to make a harmonious neighborhood, not alienate neighbors, not overbuild, not underbuild. And try not to have something that you're driving down the street and saying that sticks out like a sore thumb. The one piece that has been the significant piece that's been addressed by the Architectural Review Board for residential are the garage front houses. And the fundamental premise there is we approve two-car wide garage doors all the time. The intent is that we don't want that garage to be the main focus of the front of your house. As you're
I
driving
live
down.
in one, by the way.
There are lots of them.
Yeah.
But there's also market data that shows that garage front houses that have driveways and garage doors in the front door 20 feet back, there is legitimate real estate market value that shows that those houses stay on the market longer and they sell for less. So there are direct implications for architectural design guidelines on the value of our real estate in our city.
I'm a little bit opposed to spending almost $100,000 on a study that, or I guess we would have some firm guidelines or whatever, but it's like, it just, to me, it sounds like just, you're gonna set standards that, who's gonna enforce them? How's that gonna be enforced? Is it gonna be a change in code completely?
Currently, this board is enforcing those.
Right.
If you look at the Manchester Road guidelines,
Right,
this board enforces those.
right. We've done pretty well in the past 20 years.
But you also have a Manchester Road guideline.
Right,
We already have a component of this.
right.
So
But and then we're gonna spend $100,000 to redo it?
because that component does not exist anywhere outside of a very narrow geographically designed area.
We have an urban design for the Hanley Road. We have the one for the Promenade. We have one for Brentwood Square. We have one with Manchester. So I'm not sure what else is going to be done as
All
far
of
as.
the single-family and/or
Oh,
multifamily
the
that's
single
not
family,
addressed.
I understand.
Yeah.
I don't think the commercial really needs to be part of it.
So the discussion at the Board of Aldermen was that to bring, when I do my staff review, I bring the elements of the Manchester Road corridor recommendations or zoning about the use of materials, creating an entrance. I've brought that into all of the review elsewhere. And so we need further guidelines to help assist in that review. And so applicants know what is anticipated and what is needed prior to even submitting.
I understand that for the commercial side, it's already established. You saw, talking about the residential side, I would be for that a little bit more than doing all the commercial as well.
Yeah, but we're getting into buildings are being remodeled, renovated, commercial
They
buildings.
come before a site plan. It's already in place.
The design guidelines for the rest of the city, I'm not aware that they're already in place. They
No,
were
not
included
the
as part of
design guidelines. When somebody comes for the board, they have to prove what they're doing, a site plan and that sort of thing. So they have to have that approved by us before they go forward.
Right, but if a recent discussion was with the apartment complex at the 200 Hanley Industrial Court, I had to pull out the recommendations and the design discussions from the MC district to apply to the rest of the city. This would help us pull all of that in under general discussion for the entire city. There were elements of that project that was brought forth for that discussion, and that's what would assist us in laying that out with the developer prior to their submittal of what those discussions will be. And what is the recommendation or from the guidelines.
But that's worth $100,000. It seems like a lot of work that has to be done, but I'm not in favor of spending that kind of money as far as that's concerned. So that's all I am. I'm sorry.
I just think I'm in favor of it, as Matt was. I know we had several discussions tonight, both stormwater and parking, about sort of harmonizing our approach with that of other surrounding communities. And as a practitioner, I know that this is something that exists in the communities around us very much so. Sorry, I'm joking. So I'm sort of in favor, even though I've been on the other side of the table, right, and I've had sort of, some limitations put on my design, based on a guideline, I still found it useful as an expectation manager, and certainly to help with the discussions we have at the ARB level to have harmonized things and to have a better argument, frankly, to keep these things in line. So, I mean, I'm definitely in favor of it, both the fairness within the city and also the sort of the parity around us. I think it makes a lot of sense. So.
Anyone else? Anyone online have any more comments? Yeah.
Is it possible for us to scroll down the webinar chat, please? Or
I can't see her comments up, so I don't know.
Comments are Manchester Road was unique. We do not need this for commercial. That was intentional. She agrees with John. We don't need design guidelines for commercial. They go through our P&Z process. We don't need it for the entire city. It's a huge waste of money. I don't want to be like Clayton or Webster at all.
Okay. Other comments? I guess we need a motion.
Move to approve the expenditure noted in the report.
Sorry, the Board of Aldermen approved the budget and requested the RFQ. What we're recommending tonight is that that H3 Studio is the top candidate and to proceed with entering into a contract for that, for the design guidelines.
So it's a recommendation to the Board of Aldermen.
Yes.
So the motion would be to recommend to the Board of Aldermen that the city engage H3 Architects, is that the name? H3 Studio, for the purpose of developing architectural guidelines.
So I would recommend that this board approve to the Board of Aldermen engaging H3 Studio to produce the guidelines.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second? All right, let's take a vote. Oh. What?
Is there any discussion? So the thing is, it's like, can the commercial be taken out, just a residential side? That's what I would be in favor of. If you take some commercial side out of it, that's what I recommend, but I don't know if that can be done at this point.
I mean, we can certainly, at this point, the RFQ was for, and the direction from the board was for both commercial and residential. So I don't think we can separate them out at this point.
If the member wishes to propose an amendment to the motion to limit the engagement for residential development only, that I believe is what you are saying, is that correct?
Yes.
So you would make a motion to amend the motion. There may or may not be a second, and then the amendment is voted on before the main motion.
Before we do that, let me ask a question. If the expenditure and the concept of this was already approved at the aldermanic level, and we're now only approving the candidate in particular, then would that amendment make any sense in this motion? Like, it seems like it isn't applicable.
It's the expression of the commission's opinion, so you can express whatever, the commission
Feel
can
applicable
express
to the
whatever
motion at
opinion it
hand,
has.
yeah.
So, John, did you want to make
I
a
would
motion
make
to
that
amend it?
motion if I don't get a second, that, I understand.
Okay, so you're making a motion to,
Do what exactly? what-
Amend the pending motion to eliminate application of the design guidelines to commercial properties.
commercial properties,
I
okay.
believe Sherry's making a motion, although I can't see her comments. I don't
Yeah.
know why.
Be
Okay.
second. Okay, so we have to vote on the amendment first, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so all in favor of the amendment for commercial only? Or
Residential only.
breaking out the, not including commercial.
Sherry Bilderbeck. Matt Foreman.
No.
Jeff Hunt.
No.
Carl Carlin.
No.
Paul Moran. No. Brian Nolan.
No.
John Ehrenberger.
Yes.
Lisa Sherring.
No.
That didn't pass.
Okay, so now we do a vote for just the amendment,
But the motion.
the motion
Recommend.
to recommend.
Point H3 Studio.
Yes, okay,
All
take
right.
a vote.
Sherry Bilderbeck. Matt Foreman.
Yes.
Jeff Hunt.
Yes.
Carl Carlin.
Yes.
I'm a yes. Brian Nolan.
Yes.
John Ehrenberger.
No.
Sherring.
Yes.
And that motion's approved.
Thank you. Moving on to new.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, yes, yes.
Gavel.
If I may, I want to follow up on a comment I made in response to the member's inquiry earlier
Sure.
concerning the relationship between the city and private indentures, because I wouldn't want anyone listening to this meeting to misunderstand. The city's focus on enforcing its ordinances does not deprive private indentures of their authority or their force. But the city doesn't enforce them. Those are enforced by the trustees, by the resources of the subdivision or the trust, and are fully enforceable. The fact that the city issues a permit that is to do something contrary to the indentures does not mean that the permit holder can do it, because the trustees or the subdivision may enforce their regulations and prohibit it. We don't trump their regulations, we only enforce ours. So I just want to make sure no one got the impression that the trust indentures don't matter.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. All right, I'm not seeing any new business. Alderman, any aldermanic report? I don't see any aldermen, none are online. The planning and development report?
So I had indicated at the last meeting that Chick-fil-A was looking to revise their site design layout. They asked to postpone from this meeting to the next meeting, so that will be on the September 13th meeting. And we'll see. If we have anything else, we'll keep you posted, but we will have a September 13th meeting as of right now, so.
Okay.
Commissioned a traffic study.
That's one
I
good
guess
neat
not
one.
yet.
Yes.
All right,
Are aware.
do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn, Mr.
Second.
Chairman.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.